came!
Of course. Merry Christmas.
They're beautiful. Come in, get warm.
Thank you.
Snow did not fall that winter in gentle flakes, but in heavy sheets, as though the sky itself had grown weary and was emptying its burden upon the land. The Wyoming territory lay muted beneath it. Hills and scrub swallowed whole, fences erased, roads lost to memory. At the edge of what had once been a railroad camp, now abandoned, stripped of purpose and warmth, stood a narrow wooden structure, leaning slightly to one side, its boards darkened by years of wind and lye soap. It was a laundry shack by design, though few used it anymore. Inside lived Lin Xiaoyue, and on that Christmas Eve she was very much alone. The cold had a way of entering places that should have been sealed. It slid through the cracks between planks, crept under the door and settled into the bones. Xiaoyue had learned to move slowly to preserve heat, to keep her back straight and her breathing steady, as her mother once taught her during damp winters along the Pearl River. But this cold was different. It did not retreat with the sun. It lingered, biting, unrelenting. She fed thin sticks of wood into the stove, listening to them crack and surrender, knowing she had only enough fuel for a few more hours. Her hands bore the proof of survival. The skin was red and split, the nails broken and rimmed with soap residue that never fully washed away. She wrapped them in cloth when the pain grew too sharp, though even cloth had become a luxury. The kettle atop the stove held rice water, no rice left to cook, only the faint cloudiness of grains scraped from the bottom of a sack days ago. She stirred it slowly, not for flavor, but for comfort. Steam rose and vanished into the rafters, carrying with it memories she tried not to invite. She had been 17 when she left Guangdong, too young to understand contracts written in a foreign tongue, too desperate to question promises. They told her there would be work, steady pay, a chance to send money home. They did not tell her about the isolation, or the way people looked through her as though she were smoke. They did not tell her that when the railroad was finished, men would leave without looking back, and women like her would be left behind, useful only as long as they were needed, invisible once they were not. Xiaoyue had learned the English word for Christmas from overheard conversations and drunken laughter outside her shack in years past. She did not know its meaning beyond excess, extra drinking, extra shouting, extra cruelty. Once a man had thrown snowballs at her door, laughing when she did not answer. Another year, someone had scrawled chalk marks on her wall she could not read, but understood well enough. By the way, they were spat out. So this year she barred the door early, extinguished the outer lantern and made herself small. She knelt by the stove and whispered the names of her ancestors, the ones her mother insisted could still hear her even across oceans. She asked for warmth. She asked for strength. She did not ask for miracles. Experience had taught her better than that. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the scent of snow and the sound of something else, hoofbeats, faint at first, then steadier. Xiaoyu froze, her body responding before her thoughts could catch up. Riders rarely came this far anymore, and when they did, they brought trouble more often than trade. She stood slowly, extinguished the stove flame, and reached for the wooden latch that held her door shut. The knocking came softly once, then again. Not the drunken pounding she had learned to fear, but something measured, respectful, almost hesitant. Xiaoyu's heart hammered as she pressed her eye to the narrow gap between boards. Lantern light flickered outside, warm against the snow, and behind it stood a man on horseback. Tall, even-seated, his coat dusted white, his posture weary but steady. She did not open the door. The man waited. Snow gathered on his shoulders. After a moment he spoke, not loudly, not sharply. His voice was low, carried by the wind, but not swallowed by it. Xiaoyue understood only fragments. Storm, dangerous, checking. She remained silent, her breath shallow. Slowly, deliberately, the man dismounted. He set the lantern on a barrel a few paces from the door, then removed his hat and stepped back. Hands visible, palms open. He spoke again, slower this time, as though shaping each word with care. Just passing through. Didn't know anyone still lived out here? Xiaoyu's fingers tightened on the latch. She weighed her choices with the precision survival demanded. If she did not answer, he might leave, Or he might assume the shack abandoned and break in later for shelter. If she opened the door, she risked everything. Hunger made decisions harder. So did the cold. She opened the door a hand's width. Lantern light spilled inside, illuminating her face, thin, pale from winter, eyes dark and wary. The man inhaled sharply, not in desire, but in surprise. He lowered his gaze at once, stepping back another pace. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said. "Her name's Elias Crow." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he spoke did. There was no command in his tone, no expectation. She bowed instinctively, her movement stiff from cold. Elias nodded in return awkwardly, as though unsure if he was doing it correctly. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "I've got extra wood," he said, setting it down carefully. "And flour, salted meat." Xiao Yu stared at the bundle, disbelief flickering across her face. "Gifts unasked for, unearned." She shook her head slightly, murmuring a refusal in Cantonese. Elias did not understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He held up a hand. "No charge," he said, "just winter's bad this year?" Something in his voice, an old ache, familiar and worn, made her throat tighten. She opened the door wider. The shack was colder than Elias had expected. He could see his breath immediately, see the thinness of her blankets, the way her stove struggled to keep the room alive. He did not comment. Men who had known loss learned quickly when silence was kinder. He moved with purpose, fixing the loose hinge on the door with a nail from his pocket, patching the roof with scrap canvas he carried for emergencies. Xiao Yui watched him, half expecting him to ask something in return. He never did. When he finished, Elias hesitated, then reached again into his saddlebag. This time, he pulled out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine. He had bought it weeks earlier in town, intending it for no one in particular, perhaps a hired hand, perhaps never used at all. "It's cold," he said simply, placing it on the table and stepping back. Xiao Yue unwrapped it slowly, revealing a wool scarf dyed a deep, patient blue. Her breath caught. She pressed it to her face, the scent of lanolin and clean cloth overwhelming after months of smoke and soap. Tears fell before she could stop them. Elias shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "I should go," he said. "Storm's easing. You take care." She bowed deeply this time, clutching the scarf to her chest. "Thank you," she said, the words halting but sincere. Elias mounted his horse and rode away, not looking back until he reached the ridge. When he did, the shack glowed softly against the snow, a small defiance against the dark. He felt something stir in his chest, something he had buried alongside his wife 7 winters ago. Inside, Zhao Yu wrapped the scarf around her neck, its warmth seeping into her skin, into places the cold had claimed long ago. For the first time since arriving in America, Christmas passed without fear, and neither of them knew it yet, but this night had already altered the shape of their lives. Elias Crow did not intend to return the next day. He told himself that as he rode back toward his ranch, the blue scarf's image still lingering, in his mind like a ghost that refused to fade. Kindness, he reasoned, was meant to be brief. Lingering only complicated things. And complication was something he had learned to avoid with the same care one avoided thin ice. Yet as dawn broke pale and weak over the snow-covered land, Elias found his horse turning east instead of south, his hands guiding the reins without conscious command. By the time he noticed, the decision had already been made, and the road, if it could still be called that, had carried him halfway, back toward the abandoned camp. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so complete it rang in the ears. Snow lay untouched, smooth as linen stretched tight. Elias remembered another winter years earlier, when silence like this had followed the fever. His wife, Margaret, had been warm one moment, shivering the next, her breath shallow as though the air itself had turned against her. The doctor came too late. The child never drew breath at all. After that, Elias learned how silence could be louder than gunfire. He had buried himself in work, in distance, in routine. The ranch survived. He survived. But nothing had ever truly returned. The sight of the laundry shack emerging from the white brought him out of memory. Smoke rose thinly from its crooked chimney, Relief passed through him before he could stop it. She had survived the night. Xiaoyu heard the horse before she saw him. Her body stiffened, fear flaring again, but it softened when she recognized the shape of the rider, the careful pace, the way he dismounted well before reaching her door. She had slept with the scarf wrapped around her neck, its warmth lingering even after she removed it. She folded it neatly and placed it beside the stove, as though it were something sacred. Elias knocked once, lighter than before. When she opened the door, she did not bow immediately. Instead, she studied him, searching for signs of danger. Finding none, she stepped aside just enough to show she was listening. "I was checking fence lines," Elias said, "though there were no fences here anymore. Thought I'd see if you needed anything else." Xiaoyu hesitated, then shook her head. "You helped," she said slowly, the words careful, practiced. "Enough." Elias nodded. He did not press. He glanced at the stove, at the patched roof. "Good," he said. "Storm might come again. If it does, my ranch is 2 hours south. You can come." The offer startled her. She had heard offers before, always carrying hooks beneath their words. This one felt different, but difference alone did not make it safe. She lowered her eyes, murmuring thanks without promise. He left again, and this time Xiaoyu watched until he disappeared beyond the rise. Days passed. Elias returned every few mornings, always with reason enough not to raise suspicion, even in his own mind. Once it was firewood, another time a sack of dried beans. He never stayed long. He never entered unless invited. Slowly, Xiaoyu began to speak more, her English growing steadier with use. Elias learned that she had come from a river village, that she had once embroidered festival robes, that she missed the sound of bells at dawn. He did not ask why she was alone. Town, however, noticed. Men at the mercantile spoke Elias's name with raised brows. A woman whispered something sharp behind her hand. Elias met each look with the same calm indifference he reserved for bad weather. He had buried worse than gossip. One afternoon, he found Xiaoyu coughing, her movements slow. He frowned not in judgment but concern. "You're burning too much wood," he said gently. "This place leaks heat." She smiled faintly. "It is old," she replied. "Like bones." The word struck him harder than she intended. He knelt, reinforcing the stove seal, tightening gaps, moving as though the work itself were an answer to something he had long avoided. That evening, he surprised himself by staying. Xiaoyu cooked what little she had, rice with wild greens. Elias had shown her how to gather safely. He ate quietly, tasting care in every bite. When he finished, he placed coins on the table. She pushed them back. "No," she said firmly. "Guest?" Elias studied her, then nodded. "Thank you," he said, and meant more than the meal. As dusk fell, wolves howled somewhere distant. Xiaoyu stiffened. Elias stood at once, resting a hand near his rifle, not in fear, but readiness. The sound faded. Silence returned. "Not close," he said. "You're safe." She believed him. That night, as Elias rode home, he realized something unsettling. The silence no longer screamed. It waited. And for the first time in years, he wondered what it might sound like filled. Winter did not loosen its grip simply because days passed. It tightened, as though angered by endurance. Snow packed itself against the walls of the laundry shack, sealing the lower boards until Xiaoyu had to dig her way out each morning. The wind returned sharper, carrying ice that stung the skin like thrown sand. Yet something within her had shifted. Where dread once lived, there was now routine, small, fragile, but real. She rose at dawn, tended the stove, folded the blue scarf with care, and waited, no longer with fear, but with a quiet attention she had not known how to name before. Elias came less often as the cold deepened, not from neglect but necessity. His ranch required him more in harsh weather, and when he did arrive, his visits were shorter, his expression heavier. Xiaoyu noticed the way he moved when tired, the slight stiffness in his left shoulder, the way his eyes drifted beyond her shack as though measuring distances no one else could see. She did not ask. Some silences she had learned were invitations to patience. One evening the cold struck without warning. The wind rose so suddenly it sounded like something alive, clawing at the walls. Xiao Yui fed the stove until the last stick was gone, wrapping herself in every cloth she owned. By nightfall, the heat failed. Her breath came shallow. She pressed the scarf against her throat, thinking not of rescue, but of staying awake long enough to greet the morning. The knock came near midnight. She startled, fear flaring hot and bright, but then she heard his voice, strained by wind, calling her name with care. She opened the door to find Elias bent low against the storm, snow plastered to his coat, his horse trembling behind him. "You can stay here tonight," he said without preamble. "This one's bad. Worse than the last." She hesitated only a heartbeat. She trusted him now, not because he had promised safety, but because he had never demanded belief. She gathered her things quickly, leaving behind what could be replaced. Elias wrapped her in his spare coat before she could protest, lifting her onto the saddle as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The ride to the ranch was long and brutal. Xiao Yui clung to the horse, Elias's presence steady behind her, his voice a constant anchor in the wind. When the ranch house finally emerged from the storm, lanterns glowing like welcome instead of warning, Xiao Yui wept, not from fear but relief. Inside, warmth surrounded her, real warmth, the kind that seeped into joints and memory alike. Elias set water to boil, laid blankets by the fire, moved with practiced efficiency. He gave her space, always space. When she was settled, he sat across the room, staring into the flames as though they might speak. "I lost my wife here," he said suddenly, his voice low. "Years ago, fever took her fast." Xiao Yu listened, her hands wrapped around a warm cup, her body finally still. "I thought if I stayed alone long enough," he continued, "the quiet would stop hurting." It didn't. She did not answer with words. She simply placed the blue scarf beside him on the table, a bridge between losses. He looked at it, then at her, something unguarded passing between them. The storm raged through the night, but inside, silence softened. By morning, the decision was unspoken yet clear. Yao Yue would not return to the shack, and neither of them would face winter alone again. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, testing the land the way a cautious animal tests ice, retreating and returning until it was certain the ground would hold. Snow receded in narrow channels, revealing dark earth beneath, damp and raw, as though the world itself had been newly uncovered. For Xiao Yue, the ranch became something more than shelter. It became a place where time behaved differently. Mornings began with the crackle of fire and the smell of boiling water, not the dread of wind pressing through broken boards. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly, how sunlight reached the table just after dawn, how the stove demanded patience, how silence here felt different from the kind she had known before. Elias gave her space without distance, a balance shaped by loss. He rose early, tended livestock, repaired what winter had broken, and returned by dusk with his boots heavy with mud and thaw. He did not tell her where she must be or what she must do. Instead, he asked about food, about comfort, about whether the room she slept in held warmth long enough through the night. Yao Yue answered carefully at first, then with growing ease. She cooked meals using what they had, simple stews, restretched with barley, flavors adapted from memory and necessity. Elias ate with gratitude, never commenting on what was missing. Word spread faster than spring meltwater. By the time the road softened enough for wagons to pass again, people knew there was a Chinese woman living at Crow Ranch. Some spoke with curiosity, others with suspicion sharpened by ignorance. Elias met each visitor at the gate now, his posture relaxed but unyielding. No one crossed without invitation. No one lingered long. Xiao Yui felt the tension even when no one spoke. She sensed it in the way Elias watched the horizon, in the way he chose his words when neighbors stopped by. Once a man laughed and said something coarse. Elias's reply was quiet, measured, final. The man did not return. Inside the house, something delicate began to grow. Not love, not yet, but understanding. Xiao Yue mended Elias's shirts, reinforcing seams worn thin by years of labor. Elias built her a small table by the window, smoothing the wood until it no longer snagged skin. They spoke in fragments, gestures filling the gaps. He taught her the names of plants safe to eat in the wild, She taught him how to steep tea leaves until bitterness softened. One afternoon, while planting early greens, Xiao Yue collapsed. The world tilted, sound dulling as though wrapped in cloth. Elias reached her in seconds, his fear sharp and immediate. Fever followed by nightfall. He remembered fever too well. He stayed beside her, refusing rest, cooling her skin, speaking aloud not because she could answer, but because silence frightened him again. Xiao Yu drifted in and out, hearing his voice like a tether. She dreamed of rivers and snow, of lanterns floating toward shore. When the fever broke, Elias sat back, exhaustion overtaking relief. Xiao Yu watched him then, really watched him. Seeing the lines grief had carved, the kindness that endured despite it. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. He did not pull away. Outside, the land continued its slow awakening. And inside the ranch house, something unspoken settled into place, fragile, uncertain but alive. Summer came fully at last, not gently, but with a strength that bent grass and swelled the creek until its banks darkened with life. The land around the ranch no longer looked like something merely endured. It looked claimed. Xiao Yui moved through it with a growing surety, her steps no longer tentative, her eyes no longer lowered by habit. She learned the horses by temperament rather than name, learned which hens would peck and which would scatter, learned the shape of Elias's days well enough to sense when he would return before she heard him, and Elias, without remark or ceremony, began to shape his life around her presence, as though it had always been meant to be so. Yet peace on the frontier was never complete, only temporary. A sickness swept through the nearby settlement late in the season, carried by dust and heat and too many bodies pressed together. Elias rode supplies into town and returned quieter each time, his jaw set, his eyes shadowed by things he did not say. Xiao Yue noticed his cough first, light and infrequent, then lingering. She brewed teas from roots and leaves she trusted, urged him to rest, but he waved it off, stubborn as the land itself. When the fever finally took him, it did so with cruel swiftness. Elias collapsed near the corral just after dusk. Xiao Yue dragged him inside with a strength born of fear. Laying him on the bed, he had never once claimed as fully his own. She tended him as he had tended her, through long nights where the fire burned low and the air felt heavy with breath and waiting. She spoke to him in her own tongue, prayers shaped by memory and desperation, telling him he was not allowed to leave, not yet, not after teaching her how it felt to belong. He drifted in and out, murmuring names from another life, his hand clutching at hers as though it were the only solid thing left. Xiao Yue did not let go. She cooled his skin, forced water past cracked lips, watched the rise and fall of his chest with a focus so intense it left no room for fear. She had crossed oceans. She had survived hunger and hate. She would survive this too, but only if he did. When the fever broke, it did so quietly, without triumph. Elias slept for nearly a day afterward, his breathing evening out at last. Xiao Yue sat beside him, exhaustion settling into her bones. Only after certainty returned. She rested her head against the bed frame and closed her eyes, tears finally spilling free. When Elias woke, the first thing he saw was her, hair loose, eyes rimmed red, the blue scarf folded neatly at her side like a vow kept. He reached for her without thinking. She took his hand. "I thought I'd buried all this," he said hoarsely. "The wanting, the fear." Xiao Yu shook her head slowly. "It was sleeping," she replied. "Not gone." Outside, autumn edged closer, the air sharpening again. They spoke then, truly spoke, of pasts that could not be changed, and futures that might yet be shaped. Elias did not offer grand promises. He offered truth, a place, a life shared if she chose it freely. Xiao Yui answered, not with hesitation, but with certainty born of trials survived. They married when the first frost silvered the fields, with no audience beyond the land itself, and two witnesses who mattered. Xiao Yu planted plum saplings near the house, their roots shallow but determined. Elias carved her a comb from maple, smoothing each tooth by hand. When Christmas returned, it did not arrive with hunger or fear, but with quiet warmth, lantern light, shared breath, and the knowledge that love had come, not in spite of hardship, but through it. And on the wall by the door, the blue scarf still hung, a reminder that the smallest kindness, offered without demand, can change the course of a life, and sometimes two.